So you wrote a piece about a week ago in the New York Daily News about data centers, and your view was kind of interesting to me because, look, I think a lot of venture capitalists that we had on the show, I mean, they're very much for building out AI and everything that it will take to build the capacity. You had a bit of a nuanced view on this. What was your message that you were trying to send?
Yeah, that when we think about whether it's data centers or really tech in general, we can't just think about what's best for us. If we are developing a product that has no regulatory oversight at all, doesn't involve government or politics, sure, knock yourself out. But if you are doing anything that is regulated by government anyway, for you to not think about what are the politics of this issue, how will this impact consumers, how will it impact voters, how do I ensure that what I want will be both allowed and not banned? You have to take these things into account. And somehow, when the hyperscalers decided to spend trillions of dollars building data centers, the notion that they're going to impose massively higher electricity costs on consumers who were, in whatever grid they're using didn't seem to occur to them. And I think it is incredibly naive and counterproductive when you think, oh, we're saving the world, we're developing new technology, everyone's just going to love us, and we don't have to sort of think about the negative externalities of our work. And that's what's been the case. But at the same time, you're seeing consumers facing much higher electricity bills anywhere where there are data centers, and states proposing legislation, both blue and red states, saying we're not going to allow the permitting and zoning of new data centers if they're going to impose much higher costs on everyone else. And so to me, if we want data centers to happen, if we want AI to happen, we have to address this issue. And that was the point of the piece.
So how do we address the issue then?
I think that, no politician is going to sacrifice their career so that Sam Altman can become a trillionaire. Nobody cares about Sam Altman or Jensen Huang or anyone at any of these companies. They care about getting reelected. And so if your data center is going to impose meaningfully higher electricity costs on the people who actually vote in your next election, then that's not going to be allowed. And we need to come up with ideas that allow for far more efficient chips and far less energy usage and far less water usage for data centers so that they can exist and be permitted and be built everywhere that we need them. But at the same time, not become this political football that everybody on both sides sort of decides to oppose simply because it's not good for them politically. And so, look, I mean, this has been the case since I started working with Uber back in 2011, which is one of the real blind spots often that you see in Silicon Valley and you see in tech is a just ignorance of government and politics and regulation. And just like the wrong engineering can kill your company, or the wrong fundraising strategy can kill your company, or the wrong go-to-market strategy can kill your company, if you are a startup in a highly regulated industry and you are not prepared to be able to deal with the political issues, coming at you, there's a good chance you're not going to make it. And I think that especially in the AI sector, there has just been not really any thought put into it. You see this with data centers. You see it, for example, there are 24 states now that are poised to ban mental health chatbots. And that industry has done a pitifully poor job in explaining what they do, why it can be valuable to society, and how they can do it in a regulated way that protects kids and takes care of the underlying concerns that legislators have. But you have to think about this stuff.
So you are a venture capitalist, and AI is
Yep.
sort of this unavoidable area that you have to partake in as an investor. What are you investing in then, given that you have these views about
Yeah.
how the data center buildouts should happen?
Yeah, alternate forms of compute that are far more energy efficient, and energy facilities that can provide on-site power to data centers that don't require being attached to the grid. So that could be companies that have memory cylinders that are built differently that can really increase energy efficiency. There can be different types of chips entirely that are more energy efficient. We're one company called the Biological Computing Company that uses neurons from rat brains to power AI. There are companies that do microgrid nuclear or hydrogen fuel cells or turbines that can be put on site. So I think that there's a lot of investment opportunity specifically in reducing the energy needs of data centers for AI, and those are good opportunities to me.
I want to understand what you think will be the defining issues in technology heading into the midterm elections,
Yeah.
because I mean, you talked about data centers, that will be a big one. We also have prediction markets, which is sort of this other hot button issue right now. And, I'm trying to think about the stances that politicians might take heading into the midterm cycle. Are those the two big issues you think of, or what do you think will
Yeah.
really define this cycle?
Well, let me kind of redefine your question a little bit, if that's okay, which is, to me, there's one key buzzword for the midterms. And keep in mind, the midterms, when we think about it, we think about Congress, which is every member of the House and a third of the Senate. But there's also 36 governors that are for election or reelection this year, as well as, most state legislatures. So it's really across the board. Affordability is the issue of 2026. We got a preview of that in New York City with Mondami realizing that and riding that issue to victory to become the next mayor of New York City. That's what it's going to be about. So, for example, the data center issue matters because if it does increase electricity prices for your average voter, that's an affordability question. And so, from a big picture standpoint, if you are a tech company that is doing something that is deemed to be increasing costs for average people, you need to be aware of it and ready to be able to defend it and think about ways that you can change and pivot to give politicians the win that they need so they don't put you out of business entirely. Or on the flip side, you very well might be a startup that can increase affordability, and in which case you've got a real opportunity to try to say, hey, we're part of the solution here. So, like, for example, I'm an investor in a company called Ownwell that helps people with property tax appeals, and we're working on legislation in a bunch of different states so that people kind of have access to that system. That is a political winner in the sense that while obviously local governments don't want to lose property tax revenue, people do want to spend less money on their property taxes. And in a year where affordability is the question, that's really an area for success. And so prediction markets, for example, which we work on a lot, and I think I have a lot of thoughts on that we can get into, but I don't think it's going to be an electoral issue this year, in that it doesn't really impact affordability one way or the other.
What are your thoughts on prediction markets? Because this is sort of a classic federal versus state
Yeah,
battle in some ways,
for
but
sure.
that's I know probably oversimplifying it, and so
I don't think it
unpa
is actually.
unpack the nuances here
Yeah.
of
So
this. I mean,
so
where do you think
sure.
this go? Look, people are saying, and you've done a podcast on this. It'll could end up in the Supreme Court, and
Yeah.
there will be decisions there. But I mean, are there signals that tell us which way this is going?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So just to give the viewers a little bit of a level set here, there are gaming companies that are regulated by state. So that's typically the FanDuels, the DraftKings of the world that do sports betting, and they have licenses in individual states to conduct that, and then they're subject to the regulatory and taxation system of each individual state. Then there are prediction market companies that are seen as commodities, and they're regulated by the CFTC. So that's at the federal level. So they've got a different regulatory and taxation structure. So that's companies like Kalshi and Polymarket and others. And states are saying, that prediction markets really should be under their jurisdiction because the Supreme Court in 2000, I think it was 17, overturned a congressional law known as PASPA. And what PASPA was a ban on states allowing sports betting. And the Supreme Court said, no, this is really a state issue and their right to decide what to do. It's not up to Congress. And that opened up the entire industry and led to sports betting all over the US. States are saying under the PASPA ruling, they should clearly have jurisdiction over prediction markets as well. The CFTC, the federal government is saying, no, these are commodities. These are contracts that have been historically and traditionally regulated by the CFTC. It is our jurisdiction. So what you're seeing now is litigation between states and the federal government with different types of parties involved. And some of the rulings have been on the side of CFTC regulation. Some have been on the side of state regulation. Usually, when there are divided opinions across the country, that's when the Supreme Court takes up an issue. And it'll be really interesting to see how they proceed here, because on one hand, this is the court that by and large did PASPA, and is a court that is more conservative, which tends to be more favored towards states' rights. On the other hand, there is a clear regulatory framework and system that is working at the federal level. So there really may not be any reason to change that. And so, I think it's kind of one of those 50-50 things, which means that for the moment, everyone is just proceeding with the status quo because none of us have the ability to know when the Supreme Court's going to take up an issue or how they're going to decide it. But I will say this. If the court rules in favor of the CFTC, which I think there's at least a 50% chance of that, then the companies that are doing sports betting are going to become, I would argue, prediction market companies instead, because they're going to say we would far rather have one regulator and a far more preferential tax system than 42 different states or whatever it might be. That's going to create a giant hole in revenue for state governments. They're going to have to fill that hole. And so I think that if you're looking towards the future, iGaming, which is just online casino gaming, poker, blackjack, craps, whatever you want, I think will be the next wave. So if you're looking at who are the startups that might be able to provide interesting forms of iGaming that, customers and consumers might like, that's where kind of the next opportunity might sit.
So there's a lot there, and I think one question I did want to get your take on here on is this is the sports betting part of these operations, right? I mean,
Yeah.
when we think prediction markets, I mean, now you could bet on anything. People
Yep.
could be betting on what you're going to say here on,
Sure.
on the show today. But I have always tried to sort of segment the sports betting prediction market business from the rest of it, and where the popularity is, and also what is actually being regulated. What you're talking about here, that's only the sports betting side of the business, right? I mean,
Well,
there's
not necessarily. I mean, the court could say that all of this, in their view, is a form of gaming that is, should be controlled by the states, that within the 10th Amendment fits into state jurisdiction. Then states, you've already seen legislation in different states to ban the non-sports betting parts of prediction markets. Right now, those bills don't mean anything because they don't have jurisdiction over it anyway. But it is certainly possible that if the Supreme Court sends the entire market back to the states, that it might allow certain forms of prediction markets and not others. But with that said, I was the deputy governor of Illinois for 4 years, and I ran the state's budget. You always need more revenue. And it seems to me that if there is a way to generate more revenue, you're probably not going to say, I don't want it. There might be very specific types of contracts that they say are not allowed. But my guess is that the variety of activities offered on the sites will likely continue regardless of who regulates it.
so what's your view on who should regulate this? Which direction do you think
I,
it should?
I, I think it's working. So I understand the state's argument. I certainly, as an investor in FanDuel, we benefited tremendously when PASPA was overturned. But at the same time, I think the CFTC is doing a good job with it. I think that there's real consumer demand for it. I think companies like Kalshi are doing a really good job running their businesses. And so, from my personal perspective, I am very much okay with the way it works right now. But I also think that if that is affirmed by the Supreme Court, you're going to see shifts in behavior by the companies that are currently regulated by the states, and that will both create budget holes for the states and then opportunities for new types of gaming and new types of startups.
Let me just run through the gamut of hot button regulatory issues right now
Sure.
very quickly. So, you were very involved with Uber. Now we have this autonomous vehicles shift happening. Uh, is there any roadblock right now that you see in terms of
Yeah.
autonomous vehicles that the regulations could
I
pose for
I
the
see
growth of these
two.
companies?
Yeah. So one would be at the federal level. The federal government has done an abysmal job at regulating autonomous vehicles, meaning they've just done nothing. So in 2015, there was bipartisan legislation that passed the House Energy Subcommittee unanimously that created a regulatory framework for autonomous cars. It has never moved since. Why? Because the Teamsters are scared of autonomous trucking, even though in reality it doesn't make sense because there's a massive shortage of truckers and you desperately need technology to fill the gaps. But nonetheless, Trump saw himself as a Teamsters guy, so he had his DOT just halt everything. Then Biden saw himself as a Teamsters guy, so he had his DOT do it. And now we have Trump again. And so while there are regulatory frameworks for autonomous cars and trucks intrastate, we still don't have an interstate regulatory framework. So, that's a problem because people need to be able to cross state lines. And so that's number one. Number two would be specific to autonomous taxis, whether it's Waymo or Tesla or an Uber drawing something out or whoever else, where the politics of taxis and taxi drivers will get in the way. So, for example, here in New York City, Zohran Mamdani, who's our mayor, does not want Waymo because he sees himself as an advocate for the taxi drivers and sees that autonomous taxis will remove potential jobs for taxi drivers. He's probably not wrong about that in the big picture, but the question is, how do you handle it? Which is, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Once there is a better way to do something that there's consumer demand for, it's going to happen. And so there's one of two approaches in the way I see it. One is Mamdani can choose to ignore that and just do his best to stifle it. It will happen anyway. And then when it does, the taxi drivers will be devastated. When I ran all the campaigns to legalize Uber around the US, that was the approach that the taxi industry took and got their politicians to take, which was just ban Uber completely. And then when we won all of those fights in every market, taxi was really devastated as a result. Or you could approach this far more intelligently and say, how do we think about the future of taxi drivers in a world of driverless taxis? And there can be things like licenses for autonomous taxis and revenue
Right.
streams attached to that. And that revenue stream could pay into a fund for taxi drivers. So there are intelligent ways to do it. I hope that people like Mondami and other ultra progressive mayors choose to engage that way. But, from terms of their rhetoric and their politics and everything else, you could see them just saying, technology bad, autonomous taxis bad, and just trying to stop it.
Right. Let me ask you one last question before you go.
Yeah.
So, when you are advising a company or when you do invest in a company and you sort of
Yeah.
take on this role as a regulatory advisor, and we could talk for a lot longer about this, but what is the Bradley Tusk playbook? What is
Yeah.
the strategy that you put in front of them? What does it include? What do they need to do?
Yeah.
How do you advise
Yeah.
startups to work around regulations? Is it lobbying? What is it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a really kind of a fundamental thesis that drives everything that we do here, which is we believe that every policy output is the result of a political input. Every politician makes every decision solely based on winning the next election and nothing else. And as a result, you have to figure out in any given situation how to show the elected officials or regulators you need that if doing what you want will further their chances of reelection, or if they don't do what you want, it's going to hurt their chances of reelection. That might mean lobbying. It might mean earned media or paid media or social media. It might mean a big grassroots campaign. It might be going negative on the person. Sometimes it might mean asking for permission. Sometimes it might mean begging for forgiveness. The context depends entirely on the company, the existing laws on the books, the jurisdiction, who you're disrupting, their relative political power, and a whole bunch of other variables. And I did write a book about all this called The Fixer, if anyone's interested. But it totally differs not only from industry to industry, but from startup to startup and jurisdiction to jurisdiction. We could have the same portfolio company and pursue one strategy in one state and a totally different strategy in another, simply because that's what you need to win there. But fundamentally, no politician cares about you, the startup. They don't care if you become a billionaire. They don't care if you have an exit. They don't care about your KPIs. All they care about is their own political future. I don't know if you remember when Amazon wanted to put their second headquarters in New York City. I think it was back in
Right. Right.
2019. And, hundreds of
I
cities
was living
competed.
in Toronto. Toronto, we were
Right.
everyone in
Well,
Toronto
you
was
guys
hoping
screwed
for
it up too with sidewalk. Again, you guys also messed it up. But New York City messed it up because as did Amazon, because couple hundred cities competed for this. New York kind of won a little bit out of nowhere. I don't think we were really expecting to win. And everybody's very excited. Then AOC comes out against it because her politics are she doesn't like capitalism, jobs, technology, things like that. Fine, that's who she is. So the state senator for that neighborhood in Queens, a guy named Mike Gineris, and he's just a guy. He's not good. He's not evil. He's not conservative. He's not liberal. He just wants to stay in office. That's it. And he says to himself, oh no, now that AOC is opposing this, what happens if I continue to push it forward and make it happen? And he knew, based on historical turnout data, that turnout in his next primary, and because of gerrymandering, only the primaries matter, probably about 8, 9%. Those are the most left wing voters in the district. And if someone ran against him from the left, especially with AOC's backing, they could use this issue to take him out. And he had a choice. 40,000 new jobs for New Yorkers, good paying jobs with benefits, or one job, his own, and he picked himself. And the problem isn't that Mike Gineris is the exception. The problem is that Mike Gineris is the norm. That's what politicians do. And so, unless you can show the Mike Gineris of the world that, hey, doing what we want will not only will help you get reelected, or if you don't do what we want, it will hurt your chance to get reelected, then they don't care and they're not going to do what you want. So it's always about understanding what do they need for reelection and how does your thing get framed in a way that convinces them that helping you helps them.
Great. Well, Bradley, I want to thank you for coming on. That is Bradley Tusk, founder and CEO of Tusk Ventures here on TITV.